Ms. Gay Tyler, would you take the roll first, please?
For the State Treasurer, Grant Boykin.
Here.
For the Director of Finance, Pedro Reyes.
Present.
Michael Lawson.
Here.
Sharon Hendricks.
Here.
Dana Dillon.
Here.
Chairperson Keeley, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Gay Tyler.
You're welcome.
Okay, so item number 1 is the approval of the committee agenda and work plan. Entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, moved and properly second that we approve the work plan. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? 2 is the approval of the minutes, November 8, 2012.
So moved.
Entertain a motion to move. Moved by Dylan. Is there a second for the approval of minutes?
Second.
And seconded by
I was hesitant because
seconded by Ms. Hendricks to approve the minutes from November.
Aye for a lack of a second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, thank you. Item 3 is our information item. Really, it's the entire agenda here today. Cassandra Licknock, our staff person working with the Compensation Committee, and Mr. Adam Barnett, one of the compensation consultants from our pool of compensation consultants, is here to present this item. I'll turn it over to you, Cassandra.
Thank you. Chair Keeley, this item is coming back to the committee for a continued discussion on the pay comparator groups utilized for benchmarking salaries for positions under the board's compensation setting authority. Currently, the policy outlines the compensation comparator groups as a blend of leading public funds weighted 67% and private sector firms weighted 33%. In addition to benchmarking salaries, the policy also directs where to position those salaries within the market. Currently, we're targeted at the 50th percentile or the median of our comparator groups. The policy also conditions the time frame for which base salary ranges are reviewed. Typically, they're reviewed every 2 years through a comprehensive market pay analysis using data from a third-party source. It's been nearly 4 years since the last pay analysis was completed, so the committee had put this on their 2012-13 work plan for completion. To complete the pay analysis, the committee selected a compensation consulting firm from the pool of consultants that had been established to carry out specific consulting-related activities identified in their work plan. McLaughlin, a compensation consulting firm within the committee's pool, is one of the leading performance reward consulting and benchmarking firms for the financial services industry and was the firm selected to perform this work plan activity. Since initiating the compensation salary benchmarking, originally in the policy, the committee has utilized McLaughlin on 4 separate occasions to evaluate the base salaries of impacted positions. Adam Barnett, head of asset management at McLaughlin, is here to refresh the discussion in assessing our current pay comparator groups and considerations for changing to an alternative pay comparator group. So Adam, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the presentation to you.
And, you can hear me okay? Is that okay? Thank you. So you each should have a copy of the presentation, which is largely similar, although not entirely similar to that which we had reviewed in December. Mr. Keeley, would you like us to go kind of go through the changes and kind of walk through page by page just to refresh this discussion?
The changes would be fine, and just an overview would be okay.
Okay. As Cassandra had mentioned, CalSTRS had asked us to provide guidance in assessing the comparator group that would be used for benchmarking executive pay and senior investment staff pay as part of a periodic compensation review. And what this presentation essentially goes through is why this is a and this was a question that Mr. Rosenstiel had asked several times at the last meeting, is why do we need to do this? Like, why do we have to have this whole discussion about compensation comparator group, and can't we just do what we had done before? And isn't that good enough and it's worked? well enough. So what we're really trying to identify in this report is respond to Mr. Rosensteel's questions, which were sound, and then respond to those questions, and then again refresh go back through quickly down to the different alternatives that could be considered in terms of comparator group. And that's really the purposes of this discussion. Going back to the overall purpose of this exercise, and again, Mr. Rosensteel's question, why do we want to do this? Why do we want to think of, why should we consider this whole comparator group issue? Why do we want to open it up? Why do we want to do this benchmarking stuff? Can't we just continue doing what we've done previously? And there really are three principal reasons. The first, as a proponent of good corporate governance, is to allow the board to exercise sound pay governance practices. And that's essentially to fulfill an oversight responsibility. We would think, and I'm sure the board would think, it's important for the board to understand where does the organization stand, to be fully informed about where the organization stands relative to talent. Spend lots of time providing oversight in many aspects of CalSTRS activity, and this is intended to fulfill that responsibility. Are our pay levels high, or are they low, or are they just, where are they? And a board should be able to know that and should be able to respond to that. The second is to reaffirm CalSTRS human resources strategies, meaning as Cassandra had mentioned, the last pay review took place 4 years ago. I was involved probably at this point, it's almost 10 years ago when the first compensation comparator group was defined, the one you're currently using. And in terms of just reflecting on this before mechanically just marching on with the same group, it's important to say, well, what has changed relative to the board's view about pay? There's new board members. I believe that most or all the board members that are here now were not involved in the establishment of the first compensation comparator group. So new board members may have different perspectives about pay, and it's important to ensure that the comparator group reflects the perspectives of the current board, not necessarily one from 10 years ago. And then CalSTRS' operating and investment approach is changed. It's subject to ongoing change. So to make sure that the comparator group and the pay system reflects the needs and the requirements of that investment approach. And then finally, as it relates to change, is the political and economic environment, as we all know, is subject to ongoing change. So rather than, again, just mechanically repeating what had been done in the past, it's to reflect, well, is this appropriate given our current situation? And then the third is we felt, and maybe we were inarticulate in explaining this in our last meeting, we felt it was important, we felt for the purposes of the board, we felt that it was important for you as board members to be engaged in actively monitoring and managing employee-related termination risk. And over the last few years, pay levels with the financial crisis, pay levels came down, and then when markets recovered, pay levels have basically come back to where they were pre-2007, so they've recovered. But demand for investment talent remains intense, and the ongoing risk that CalSTRS face is real. And just as evidence of that, we assembled, this is anecdotal, this was our anecdotal summary, but we looked at just for the chief investment officer position, to identify one position, to identify what's happened in other public funds over the last few years relative to chief investment officers leaving. And what you see is that the demand, you can see these are private sector firms, but in the column to the far right, you see that this is a broad range of private sector firms. Some are investment management firms, some are foundations, some are family offices, some are consulting firms. But essentially the demand for top investment talent, despite what's happened in the broader economy, despite the financial crisis, remains particularly intense. And we thought it was, and we again believe that it's important for the board in monitoring and managing risk to understand this. So those were the three principal reasons for not just, why don't we use the group that we used before? Which brings us to where we are now. So if we have these three reasons several reasons to consider a comparator group and to ensure that pay levels are reasonable and consistent with what the board's perspectives about pay and the CalSTRS overall human resource requirements, it's a cool question about, well, where do we take this? Do we use the same comparator group? Are there other ones that might be considered? And in the next few pages, I think that this is all self-evident for the board members. Again, this is reconfirming what we understood about CalSTRS. And again, Mr. Keeley, if you want me to go through it, I can, but I should be pretty clear. You're a unique institution, and you have a unique mission, and you're one of the leaders in the world relative to pension management, not just by size. Given this, there were three groups that we had, three of many potential alternatives to consider relative to pay benchmarking. There were three groups that we identified. And before we get into that, any questions so far? Any comments about what we've gone through? So the three groups, the three alternatives are, let's just stay the course. We've used this 67 public, 33% private blend for some time, and it seemed to have worked, and we have people that we think are good, so why do we want to change it? And change has unforeseen consequences, and we don't know what's going to happen, and we have to explain it, so why don't we just leave it alone? That was really the principal reasons for kind of staying the course. The weaknesses, or what we saw as objectionable, again, we were involved in setting up this group. I was involved personally, again, 10-ish years ago. You reflect upon this after 10 years and you say, well, is this really appropriate? You have the 67% weight to other public funds, and there's in the appendix in the back, and you look at the other public funds in that group. We'll flip to the page, just make sure you all see it. You look, these were the organizations that represented 2/3 of the benchmarking for pay purposes. So 2/3 of the data that would be based upon this group of firms, and you say, well, are these the organizations that we feel are like us? If our top investment people were to leave, are these the places they would go? And moreover, if we were to search for top investment people, top senior management positions, are these the places that we would look? And we were, I guess, looked at this after 10 years and we said, well, maybe these aren't the best organizations. Or these are really good organizations in the public fund space, but are these necessarily the most likely competitors for talent? Is this the most likely threat to your people? And we kind of trying to be honest with ourselves. We say probably not. Meaning, if your top people were to go and you replace like positions, it's a whole question: would they go to organizations that are, if you look at some of these, that are 1/10 the size or 20th the size? Are these of the same caliber? And if you look at the column on the bottom of the page, you see just by number of investment staff, and just to give a sense for, other than CalPERS, the actual rankings are redacted. This is in the bottom right-hand corner of that example. You'll see you're the second largest. CalPERS is the largest. So that, again, you're larger relative to assets, complexity, than most of these firms, and this represents 2/3 of the basis for your pay decision making. So again, we thought that this, going back to our assessment, our debits and credits, so to speak, on alternative one, we saw that this really doesn't seem to be sound. And then there were also 1/3 of the firms were private sector firms, where there's a broad range. There's data from over 300 private sector investment, asset management organizations, including most of them were investment management firms, but also included some banks and insurance companies. And there we have to be, again, step back and say, do those organizations reflect your mission? Meaning those organizations have a different mission, which is essentially, in most cases, gathering assets and charging clients fees to make profits. They don't have the same mission, and the jobs have some different content in that world, meaning in those worlds, individuals have to manage money and they also have to raise money and have external clients. So again, we saw that those were the principal weaknesses of the current group. Any questions? The second was basically,
We do have a question. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you. If I follow the logic that these groups are really not reflective of who we compete with, is the argument then that they shouldn't even be 1/3 of the entire universe? Should we then be compare only to the private sector because, we have really nothing in common with South Dakota Investment Council at 8 million or 8 billion, or with Division of Investment Services Georgia at 65. I mean, we're
I know, but that's
following your logic. I mean,
I think some of that is that's where this does the emperor have no clothes. We're looking at this and saying, are these really? Can we standing in front of a board or doing you're doing depositions? Can you rigorously defend this as the best possible group? And we're squirming in our seats and saying maybe not.
so, and I understand what you did 10 years ago. The world has changed. But I would argue that what these people are paying their investors or their money managers or their staff has also changed because they're also losing folks to other folks, arguably. The other question is, earlier on, we had our advisor on real estate issues. And her comment went, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't recall verbatim, was something to the fact that, consulting, they don't make a lot of money, and we lose the good ones to management. And in fact, there was a reference that somebody lost somebody to a Canadian company, and they were going to make enough money to pay Canadian taxes and U.S. taxes.
That's us. We lost.
We lost somebody. Okay.
Sorry.
So when we lose someone to something like that, I mean, doesn't matter really what we would have done. When this person gets that kind of compensation, we're not really, unless we go fully private sector, we're really not going to be competitive with them if the Canadian outfit is willing to pay them that much.
Yeah, and we're not necessarily, we wouldn't necessarily you should market to every firm, but it's a whole question of what is the market, and do you realize that if you look at the 2/3 based upon public funds, are we, I'm being very in the colloquial sense, are we kidding ourselves that that's the competition? I don't. That's the question that we want to pose. Is that really the competition for our talent?
Well, I mean, we poach from CalSTRS, they poach from us, and who do we get this person from, Chris?
Colorado.
From Colorado, and we'll poach from Ohio next, and New York. I mean, that's just, anyway.
Your price
Thank
will
you.
never compete with the private sector.
Before you continue, Mr. Barnett.
Thank you.
Mr. McGuire.
Thank you. I think question along the same lines relative to the public comparator group. We could narrow the focus to the top quartile or the top 5 of those funds also, and it might look a little bit more representative relative to the public funds as an option.
Absolutely. No, it's if you look at, and actually just to know that it's possible, this is just for one position, just as simply an illustration. What you see here on the far, this is a I don't want to zap you. It's not a laser, is it? The on the this, on the you can see on the bottom left there is top quartile for the current public fund peer group by itself without the 67-33 weighting. So that does show that there is a range around it. So that is clearly one option, is to say, well, we want to be at the high quartile of that group rather than necessarily the median of the group. This,
Sharon, Ms. Hendricks has a question.
So, but Pedro, I wanted to make sure I understood, was your point kind of, we as CalSTRS were never gonna compete with the private sector? Is that kind of what you're trying to say? Or I wanna make sure I understand your point.
That, and I guess if the argument is that, and I kind of like Terry's idea, let's focus on those that are more like us, because if you're throwing in little guys, we'll never be anywhere near those in terms of, and we go through this with, anyway, so, yeah, and what is it that I'm not even on, I'm sorry.
Right,
Is
yeah.
it okay?
Hold
Can
on
we
a
talk
second.
to each other?
Of course, have that exchange.
Let's talk, Pedro. I guess I have to,
Sharon, you,
I have to be off so you
right,
can respond to me,
so
right?
let me get
Let me be
Pedro.
done. There
There
we
you
go.
go.
I think
Pedro, I don't think it matters. If the light's on, you speak anyway. It doesn't matter. It's on or off. You're gonna speak,
My
so.
voice carries enough, but then it can't
Doesn't
get
matter.
recorded. That's the problem. I heard myself, and the little voice in the background, like, no, that's not me.
on, man.
I think I guess my point is that if we look and say 2/3 of public and 1/3 of private are not reflective or are not a good measure, well, yeah, when you have such small entities being part of the group, it's not a good measure. But I think you go back to Terry was saying, people that we actually would be competing with for staff, it's perhaps a 2/3 and a third still reflective. Because if I'm hearing that the list there is not a good list, then the extension of that is, then why are we even using it for 1/3? You ought to be using it just the private sector. Then we get into the private sector, then it would be an illogical comparison, in my mind.
so, and that's really where we said, does this make sense? And is this the best? If we were standing in front of a room full of teachers, we'll say, and they said, what is the best possible group? What is going to be, if we're leading institutional investors, if we just say, rather than just saying public funds or private sector, what are other great, really good, what are leading institutional investors? Who shows up in the press as being innovative? Who, if you speak to lots of consultants, would be viewed as leaders? And so what we did.
So let me just throw one last item. As you know,
This is where this microphone
I know,
system
I was
we
just
had,
gonna
I
say,
didn't
we
have a
could
few
do
years
okay with
ago.
that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I sit on the board of a credit union, a local credit union, and every year we go through what should we be compensating our CEO. And of course, you have the outfits out there that come by and tell you this is what you should be compensating your CEO. We're a good-sized credit union, and there's a credit union that is 1/8 our size that compensates their CEO over $1 million. There's another credit union that is a quarter of our size and is compensating their CEO close to $1 million in retirement a year if that person stays with them for 5 or 7 years. And so there are always these quirks things out there, people who are willing to do certain things for people, and then that gets thrown into the formula of the average. And yeah, that skews the average, particularly when you look at what those people do. And so I think that when you weigh in the private sector too much, you have those skews. And I don't think that we will ever be able to compete with the private sector on a dollar for dollar. And there are times when people from the private sector want to come back to the security of a state job.
Sharon?
I'm sorry, we don't mean to cut you off, but I want to ask one more thing, and then I obviously want you to finish your presentation. But I think one of my questions, and Chris, I don't know if you can answer this, but when we talk about, Terry, your idea of these top 5, the top 5 public funds that look more like us, do we have data on, how many people we lose to those types of funds, like CalPERS, versus the private sector, New York Teacher, or, I don't know what the top 5
yes.
are, but.
And in fact, I did a survey of staff. I didn't ask them about compensation, so you wouldn't realize that, but I asked them who are our peers. And I created a list, kind of like a word cloud by size of who was most often mentioned. But State of Washington, Virginia, UC are some of the places, and now British Columbia, that are among the peers that we've lost people.
So that's our, kind of our, okay.
I mean, if you
just was
look, you
curious.
remember the stats I gave you in the closed session CI report over the last couple of months. So about 40% of the senior staff leaves to peer funds. It does run all over the map. We've lost people to family offices, probably more frequently. And I was talking to Adam. Part of it is that not a lot of our staff are willing to go back to the East Coast. They like the West. And so there are fewer endowments over here, but we've tended to lose people to family offices or high net worth client-focused offices. And then some of our state peers.
Back to Mr. Barnett.
And again, you can look at the high quartile of the existing group. You can look at a smaller subset of public funds. If you do the smaller subset, then to what you mentioned, then you run the risk of statistical anomalies, that you run the risk of making paid decisions based upon 5 or 6 firms. Which is not what we would suggest. So what we reflected on is if we were standing in front of a group of teachers and saying, what is the most appropriate group relative based upon our understanding of CalSTRS, we wanted to identify other organizations that were large, that were complex, that were mission-driven, that were not in a asset gathering business, other organizations that in the investment press would be considered leaders. And then if you look on Appendix 4, what we identified, and again, there are individual firms that you say that we'd like to add one firm in or take one firm out. We would totally understand that, but as a representative group, what we tried to do is identify a balanced cross-section of leading institutional managers, which if you see the tally towards the bottom in the middle, there are 6, this group has 6 public funds, 5 leading Canadian managers. Again, they're managing government pension assets. Some U.S. corporate plan sponsors like GE or DuPont that manage money, again, for pension assets. And then 7 endowments and foundations. So what we identified is all these organizations are like CalSTRS that are managing money for, unlike the private sector firms. They're not raising this for profit, and most of them are similarly mission driven. You can see from just the counts, whereas you were, I think you ranked 2 of 2, the ranking was 2 out of the group for the public funds. Your ranking is 4 of 23 in this group, and the staff size falls from 2 of, I think, was 16 to 7 of 23. So you're looking at organizations at least from a human capital perspective, are more comparable than a 5-person investment office in Rapid City, South Dakota. And that's really what we went through in this presentation and in the prior discussion is the reasons that, again, that we thought that these organizations more similar to mission, leaders, excludes advisory firms. We think that just it's all told a better group. So our recommendation that we had shared with you in December is that we recommended that this is the group that should serve as the basis for pay benchmarking. We understand that there's a proposal to consider both groups to understand the full economic impact, and we appreciate that. But this is the group that we think is the best.
Okay, anything else, Mr. Barnett? Is that, okay. Questions? Mr. Lawson?
How do you perceive this
this list being used?
This would be used as a basis for defining pay, competitive pay, and then there'd be this decision about where within this market range should CalSTRS pay levels be targeted. So this would be used to potentially reset salary and/or incentive levels over time. But this would give you a clear sense of where are the bids, like what's the risk that we face? What is the real risk? Are we really low relative to organizations that we think are leaders like us?
Go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Boykin?
Thank you. So on Appendix 4, the group is listed as a possible alternative group. You spoke a little bit about the choices that went into the firms that are there, but you didn't take the universe and then just go down by assets under management. There were some you said that's not right. So I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about how close will this be if you brought this back? How close would this be to the actual group? And how, what's the system for figuring out who's in, who's out in the comparative group?
What is the what?
What's the methodology for deciding what firms and groups?
We would use this group. We labeled it possible because if, as an example, if a board member or staff had no input in terms of the selection of any of these individual firms. So if the board or staff felt that there was a firm that was missing that was really appropriate that they wanted to add, or if there was a reason why you wanted to exclude one of these firms for whatever reason. So this was thematically the group that we would offer. But we wanted to leave that flexibility open to you both to take staff feedback, we have not received feedback about individual firms, and we haven't received your feedback if you wanted to add any specific firm that was missing.
Just one other question. So in the past, and I get that the Canadian pension funds, the corporate plan sponsors, endowments, probably a better match with our market. But in the past, when we did private and public, we separated them and weighted one differently. So did you rule out that approach of having, U.S. public funds and all others? I mean, because now they're lumped in together, and public funds are about roughly a quarter of it. So,
I guess we tried to keep it simple to say, if we broadly speaking, who were the leading institutional investors without consideration for going back to a weighting methodology. We considered this simple to say, okay, there's a group, it's sufficiently large, meaning that we have 20-ish organizations, so that when you're not running into sample bias of any individual firm leading to distortions.
I guess I'm just wondering if there's a logic for overweighting to public funds like we have done in past.
In part, it was to have some deference to the existing group that was used, to have some anchor to at least some of the past practice. So we looked at that list primarily as the basis for deciding the adds in the construction of this group.
So along the lines of those questions on Appendix 4, why wouldn't you have included public funds like New York State or New York Teachers, Florida? There are the 6 public funds. Why wouldn't you have just said, we're going to pick the 10 largest public pension funds in America? And, because so why not some of the other ones?
Yeah, without naming us. Now we could again add, if based upon your knowledge of those firms, you'd like to add anyone, we certainly could, and without naming a specific firm, especially in a public forum that's being taped. Not all, from our working knowledge of the funds that you mentioned, not one of them, as an example, has what we consider to be an unsustainable human resource strategy.
sorry, say that again?
One of those organizations that you mentioned has what we consider to be, without naming the specific one, an unsustainable human resource strategy. So you wouldn't necessarily say they may be in a location that basically people are somewhat captive. They haven't hired many new people. Their human resource decisions are subject to intense political oversight rather than fiduciary oversight.